Okay, hello and good evening, everyone. Today I'm speaking to Murtaza Hussain. He's a journalist from The Intercept, and he wrote a very interesting article on the dark arts facing Iranian protesters. And as some of you know, my wife's from Iran, so it's a country I've taken a lot of interest in. So, yeah, we're going to try and get into the difficulty of this protest and maybe the geopolitics surrounding it and the prospects of reform or no reform. So, Mutasa, welcome.
Well, thank you, Hugo. Thank you for having me.
All right. So, you wrote this very interesting article on the dark odds facing Iranian protesters. Would you maybe just give me a little bit of a background and why you have so much insight into the Middle East, in particular?
I covered the Arab Spring for about a decade. Arab Spring, for those who don't remember or not presently aware, was a series of uprisings, revolutions took place in the Middle East from 2011 for about a decade. And, what I saw in that time is that there was a great arc of a lot of hope that existed at the start of this process. Young people were organizing, they're coming in the streets, challenging the very authoritarian governments, which existed there for a very long time. I, along other people, were very inspired by this and hopeful that it would generate a brighter future for the Middle East. And, for a few years, it did seem that could be possible, or at least at the beginning of the process. What we saw instead was that countries like Syria and Libya quickly devolved into civil war, like very terrible civil wars.
Yeah.
And Egypt, for instance, which was one of the first countries to have a revolution, it collapsed back into a tyranny, which was far worse than the one it tried to replace. And even recently, Tunisia, which had been this small country, which was the one success story of the Arab Spring, is again reverted back to a worse dictatorship than previously had existed before the uprising, and they had a very unhappy decade of economic stagnation and division
Right.
before that. So, it kind of this we tend to romanticize revolutions as, moments when things change for the better, and I think the historical record, unfortunately, doesn't really bear that out. And I don't just speak of the Middle East. I think globally,
Yeah.
most revolutions tend to, you know, maybe create a one burst of enthusiasm before things get a lot worse. And now, we see in Iran there are big uprisings of young people, very justified grievances, very brave people fighting against a very unjust regime. And, I do hope that this results in something better coming out of Iran. Maybe the government changes. Maybe they decide, agree to impose elections. Maybe they agree to dissolve themselves and leave the country and let Iranians, choose their own leaders freely. But it's not, they don't really have a lot of incentive to do that. And what we've seen in other countries is that either the security forces stay loyal to the regime and then they suppress the protests and then things go on as they are, or the security forces defect and they break away and then there's a conflict and either the leaders leave the country like Ben Ali did in Tunisia 10 years ago, or they decide to stay and fight the way that Bashar Assad did in Syria around the same
Yeah.
time. And when that happens, which is quite often, it's not something good that comes up. It's a very terrible social conflict and political conflict and military conflict often. So, I think that obviously the Iranian government's losing legitimacy with a lot of people. The economy is failing. People are angry. They're fed up with intrusive laws governing their personal lives. So they're revolting against it. But it's not so simple as everyone deciding, a majority of people even deciding they hate a government, that things then change. That's only the beginning of a very painful and long process, for which we have many examples, including in recent
Yeah.
history.
And I mean, even the revolutions that were somewhat successful, like South Africa and Namibia, yes, we had democratic reform, which I think is we were just lucky, to be honest, because there was also almost a civil war at the time. But the economic prosperity never came after the revolution. So it sort of speaks to your point. And I remember I came to Paris in 2016. So a lot of the students that studied with me were from those Arab countries, and some even from Afghanistan, as far as that. And when I talked to them, there was a bit of an ambivalent feeling towards the reform that came, because especially those in Tunisia, as you said, expected the economy to grow, but in some ways, things actually regressed, right?
Yeah, right. Well, yeah, that's also the thing too, that usually like I was in Tunisia not long after the revolution, and same with Egypt, and people have the expectation that they're revolting against all the things of the current system that they don't like, usually which manifests in inequality and lack of economic opportunity, and issues like that. But when you change the government, it doesn't necessarily mean that you've immediately imposed just social order. That takes a long. It's very hard to build from the ground up. It's not an easy process. Sometimes you can even say it's a process dependent on luck in large part. But that didn't happen in Tunisia. I saw widespread poverty a year after the revolution. Um, a lot of disenchantment. Tunisia is a very secular society for the most part, and by standards of the Middle East and North Africa.
Yeah.
But what I also saw was, and you can observe this over the next 10 years, is that when ISIS came about, it was the one country that sent a disproportionate number of members to ISIS. One of the highest per capita numbers of people who went to ISIS were from Tunisia, which, like I said, is a very secular society. It just shows you kind of how the social fabric is breaking down, and desperation and desperate ideas were coming about among people who theoretically had just won their freedom from dictatorship, but in reality, they were dealing with a much messier situation where the economy was in a completely disastrous state. Political instability is not usually good for the economy. And you saw a breakdown of law and order. You saw a lot of
Yeah.
homelessness, all types of problems, which were did exist in the previous regime, but were certainly not abolished by the revolution. So that's kind of what the issue that I see now in a lot of these countries. And look, there are other countries where they had revolutions. People wish that they never had them. Tunisia is a good case. It's a relatively benign case. Other countries, Syria, Libya, huge wars destroyed the entire society. Egypt, massacres of people in the streets, lots of detentions and torture, liquidations of politicians and journalists. Now a worse dictatorship now in power than existed before, and still the economic situation is absolutely awful. So,
Yeah.
we tend to romanticize these things, and I'm not dismissing people's hopes for a better future. And no one can say what it feels like to live in society with young person with no hope. The currency is worthless. The government is pushing you around, and the police are beating you up. It's a situation where people are liable to snap and go into the streets. It's just that when people do that, it doesn't mean that the worse things get, the better they inevitably have to get. It can always get worse, unfortunately, and that's not a very popular or exciting or you know it's not a message which people really want to hear at a moment
Yeah.
when that there is some hope. And I do hope that it's not true. It's
But
just that
you, in your article, you mentioned that the protesters in Tunisia and Syria, I think it was, were some of the brightest and most educated of the generation. Maybe you speak a little bit to that, and I guess by implication, they were a little bit naive about the change they were asking for.
young people, and I count myself among these people of that era who were naive about some of these things, is they tend to have a sense of naivete about how political and social change works. And obviously, you learn differently from experience, from observation, that things actually are a lot harder than they tend to seem. I'll tell you, when the Egyptian Revolution happened, I was there shortly thereafter, and I remember there was this very great groundswell of enthusiasm and happiness, which I also shared. It was very infectious, and I also had sincere hopes for people to have a better future. People who were very brave and sacrificed a lot, and I would say are certainly a lot. They're just ordinary people, but far braver in many cases than people are growing up with in the West, who just had the things a lot easier.
Yeah.
So you want the best for them, and they sacrifice a lot for that. But some people here and there were raising kind of concerns. Well, like, who's in power now? Like, it's a military junta in power now, and like what about all those people who ran society all these years? Like, they haven't disappeared. Like, where are they exactly at the moment? Like, who's in
Yeah.
power? No one wanted to hear that time. It was just kind of like it didn't fit the energy of the moment where people were very positive and excited. Later, in retrospect, years later, after all the terrible things that happened, I realized those people are right. Those people actually were a bit older and they're a bit more sober about things, and they just paused to kind of ask a few questions, and those questions end up meaning quite a lot. So I think that anything could happen. Theoretically, the Iranian armed forces could institute a military coup. They could decide that they want to rule directly, and then as a follow on to that, they may hold elections, or
Yeah.
the supreme leader and his family may leave the country. I don't know where they would go, but let's say for sake of argument, they left the country. They went to Syria or Russia or something.
I
Yeah,
mean, the challenge I find with Iran, and it's now speaking to my wife and her generation, she's in her 30s, I'm also in my 30s, is they have vague memories of the 79 revolution. Some of them still support it, although slightly. They support the fact that the Shah was a brutal dictator. And that is what irritates me about the Western discourse, is that they tend to romanticize the Shah's era, which is just not true. And then obviously the war that came after, many of their parents, if not brothers, all the brothers fought in that war.
uh,
So many Iranians feel, I mean, the narrative that the West is out to get them sometimes resonates with them. It has to be said, but at the same time, they are seeing the theocracy, and as you say, uh, they want the system to reform itself, but at the same time, they don't want to reform into a puppet state. And
right, right.
I feel that viewpoint is not being highlighted here. There's a lot of opportunism that is jumping, on this issue, and maybe you can speak to that, the geopolitical opportunism that comes with these type of revolutions.
Right. So look, Iranian society is 80 million people. It's a very diverse society, different views. There's diaspora, which is, very visible and vocal. You tend to hear more from the diaspora in the West, but with nature the fact that they're available, and they have a language to kind of speak to people here too, as well too. So, you do see this opportunism. You see that the different factions. I'll give you a good example. There's this group called the MEK, which are also
Yeah,
based in they're
in
based in
Paris,
Paris.
they're
In
cult
Paris, yeah.
basically.
Yeah, I did a story about them just before the pandemic, and they tried to assault myself and my cameraman
Wow.
in this area. I think this area is called the Auvers Serrois. So, very strange group of people, but they have a lot of I wouldn't say they have support, but they have a lot of elite support from certain Western politicians, certain media figures. They have a lot of money. Very curiously, people have speculated that the money comes from the Gulf, and also speculated that some support comes from Israeli and American intelligence. So we don't know, but there's certainly a faction which is very visible in the press. They have a lot of connections with Western politicians. They are good at doing social media. They have a lot of funding for their information operations. You wouldn't know from if you just talk to them, you wouldn't know that how hated they are in Iran and what a cult they
Oh
are
yeah.
and how little support they actually have. But they're able to portray themselves to unsuspecting audiences as being far more important and influential than they are. So that's just one group. And then there are the monarchists you alluded to. Like, I
Yeah.
don't think a lot of Iranians want the monarchy back. They weren't very happy with it at the time. They tried to revolt against it back then as well too. But they did revolt against it. So, this is actually a great example of the problem with political change too, is that people are all united perhaps about one narrow subject, which is they don't like the status quo. But beyond that, they're not united by anything. They usually hate each other for many, many
Yeah.
reasons. And when the status quo goes, the next war between them is likely to begin. And I'm not saying that will necessarily happen in Iran, but it certainly has happened in many other societies where people are as divided, if not more, on various different subjects. And
Mm.
I think that look, if you look at it from a non-Iranian perspective, a lot of people don't like this government for other reasons. They don't like it because the U.S. has a standoff with Iran for going back for a very long time over many different issues. They would like to see his government change, and I don't think they particularly care what replaces it. If some
Yeah,
Mike Pompeo,
they just want a puppet regime basically.
they want a government which does what they say. Basically, that's what they want, and I don't think most
Yeah.
Iranians want that. They're jealous about their independence and so forth. But when you're in a desperate situation, you'll take help from whoever you can get. When you feel that there's no other option to try to get power back in your country, you will work with somebody who maybe doesn't have your best country's best interests at heart in the long term. And you can't judge that, it's understandable. But certainly, that's a problem with, a situation like this too, is that there's a lot of exploitation that takes place. And a lot of
Mm.
different countries have interests which are not the same as the people of the country in all cases.
Yeah. You wrote an interesting point in the article where you mentioned that the nature of the Middle Eastern dictatorships and then maybe North African ones was that as they evolved and emerged over time, they literally stamped up out all opposition. I mean, we sort of touched on this now. The MEK and the Royalists and perhaps the Baluch fanatics are the only opposition in Iran. There is nothing really inside of the country. And the argument that you made is that, well, if careful what you wish for, because if you get rid of the only political structure there is, the regime will collapse, right?
Right. And when a government collapses, if it collapses and is replaced by an opposition movement, which people know and understand and can at least point to an organized opposition, then it could be okay. Or if they transition power willingly to a transitional government, which they allow time to form, then fine. If it collapses and there's a vacuum, that is absolute chaos in any society. Doesn't matter if it's Iran, doesn't matter if it's the United States. You're going to create a situation of anarchy. In a situation of anarchy, the people who reestablish order are the people who have guns and the most guns and the most training with weapons and violence, and that's what happens in every society.
Mm,
When the U.S. invaded Iraq, they deposed the Iraqi government. They created a vacuum, and the only people who could reestablish order at that time was again the people with the most guns who ended up being the U.S. military after a lot of struggling and fighting. So, you see this time and time again. You saw it in Syria too, in areas where the government lost control. Oftentimes, in the face of popular democratic protests, even liberal protests, you could say, the people who took power were not the same liberals. They were the people the Salafi jihadists with guns, in many cases, who came and took
mm.
power and
The
imposed
ones
order.
who are based organized, basically, they come in.
Most organized, most weapons, most money, and they liquidated even the more popular militant groups who were maybe less extreme, or they were just nationalist. So this is what tends what happen. If you were to just create a vacuum in Iran, who has the guns in Iran today? It's the IRGC, it's the Basij, it's the police and military. And if they're loyal to the government, which so far they seem to be, then they're going to either reestablish that government in some form, or they're going to decide that we're going to rule it directly as a military
Mm.
dictatorship, which very, very common form of government throughout history. And I think that Iran has not has quite a bit in common with Egypt and even with a country like Pakistan in the sense that, and Turkey before Erdogan, in the sense that, there is a political structure, civilian political structure,
Yeah.
but there's obviously a military oligarchy behind that. And that military oligarchy is not just, in charge of maintaining external defense and internal security, they're also deeply embedded in the economy, which is the same in Egypt and Pakistan. They control huge swaths of the economy, to covert means. They
Yeah,
have
I
big.
think the stats I looked at the other time is something between 30 to 50% of the Iranian GDP is in one way or another influenced by the Revolutionary Guard.
That's right. That's right. It's basically, they've embedded themselves in the board of directors and companies. They're very deeply plugged into society. So getting all that out is not, how would one even do that? How would one completely
Yeah.
remove a regime which is so deeply involved in
Well, I mean,
the,
take the United States. I don't think the picture looks much different, you know. So it's kind of like that structure is the one that will stay in place. And
right,
my
right,
my view of Iran has been that within Iran itself, I'm not talking about the diaspora now, even within the mullah establishment, if you will, there is democratic elements. And
right, right.
the best approach for the West should be to try and incentivize those elements to make their argument. But every time they do that, the West imposes sanctions to punish Iran, and that emboldens the hardliners. And then
Yeah,
the story starts all over again.
that's absolutely right. Look, I think the nuclear deal was an opportunity to get the situation into a soft landing or get to a big part of the problem in Iran is the standoff with the West because
Yeah.
sanctions make it very hard to govern society. They create economic suffering. They do all types of things. So, a lot of people tend to turn against their system when they feel it's not developing, giving them the basics of life. And now people have dealing with inflation, no savings, lack of access to goods. Of course, they're going to finally rebel against the system that's antagonizing them for other ways. And the killing of this woman, the death of this woman in custody was the spark over much broader anger, clearly. So,
Okay.
they've tried to walk down this conflict, but nuclear deal was the best opportunity to do so. it was not given the chance to succeed. Almost immediately after it started, it came under attack, and then Trump finally ended it not long after, reimposed sanctions. So, I don't know. I think that unfortunately there are people in America who are very invested in this conflict. They have a very extreme position on it, as extreme as people on the Iranian side who are the most extreme. And as a result, they've decided that we're not going to negotiate with this government in any form. But there's
Hmm.
no actual replacement for the government either. So what exactly is going to happen now? I think they are okay with Iran perhaps developing a situation of ungoverned chaos. If we can't negotiate with this government and there's not another government to negotiate with, let's have no government in Iran, or let's have a government where it's just a vacuum. I think it's very dangerous. It'll be very bad for Iranians, obviously, for obvious reasons, but you're going to end up with the Revolutionary Guards governing the country. You're going to have a military
Yeah.
general perhaps governing the country, and they may be more extreme. They may be, perhaps maybe they be less, but they could also be more extreme than the current system. And also, a lot of the radicalization of Iranians politics has came about because of past generations of foreign meddling in the country. And actually during the constitutional revolution in Iran, maybe a century ago, a lot of Iranians turned to the United States, who they saw
Yeah.
as potentially a savior from what they saw as English imperialism in their country or Russian imperialism in their country. They thought, well, America is a democratic country. Let's make offers to them. Let's offer friendship to them. Let's invite them to take an interest in our country.
I mean, even with Israel, until I think it was the year 2000 or so, Iran and Israel still had very good relations. Israel sold them weapons during the Iran-Iraq war, and today, I mean, it's laughable to even make that argument. So it's very difficult to see. I mean, to realize that there's actually common interest between the countries, at this stage. But better things have happened.
Yeah, yeah, there are a lot of common interests theoretically between Iran, Israel, and the United States. They've been friends before. Iranians have not always been so anti-American. The Iranian establishment has not always been so anti-American. It was quite pro-American one time. But what happened was, this previous eras of perceived meddling in Iranian politics has radicalized Iranian politics observably for the past few decades. And coup in the 50s, the Shah,
Yeah,
it created a lot of paranoia and anger. And if you do another coup, or if you create another situation where the government collapses and people are not happy with what happens after that. If you collapse the government and you impose democracy, then great. But if the government collapses and there's chaos, and there's a lot of suffering, then you're going to create another radicalized generation, 30 years from now,
yeah.
who's even more angry about all these things that have taken place. So, I don't know. I think that, it's not really, what can I say? It's not really for us to say. It's for people in Iran to decide, determine. I think that, there's reason for optimism whenever things are changing to some degree because, like I said, something good could happen. The government could decide to impose elections. It could compromise in a very major way. The security forces could decide to take control and maybe impose a totally new order where there's
Yeah.
democracy and things like that. I don't think there's a lot of examples of that happening, but
No,
it's
no.
possible.
I was
And
to say that the closest you get is probably South Africa, where I mean, as I say, we almost had a military takeover, but then fortunately, the leader of the military at the time said he will not intervene, and
right, right,
that saved the country from total collapse. And it's not even sure today if it's entirely stable. But next door to us was Zimbabwe, which the military did step down as well. Took over, a new regime came into power that started slaughtering people within 5 to 6 years. So again, I think we're pretty much in agreement there. That's what one wants to try to avoid over there. I guess I have this question for you. How serious do you think this protest really is? Is this really going to be a regime changing protest, or is this something that the Revolutionary Guard would easily suppress?
well, if the security forces and the Revolutionary Guard and the police, if they side with the government and they remain loyal to the government, then it's no problem to suppress the protest because
Yeah,
you have all the weapons, and eventually, inevitably, people get tired. They get tired, and they will have to go back to their homes. They need to work again. They need money, so they can't protest every single day. And because of the immiseration of society by sanctions and other measures, it's likely to happen sooner than later. So if that's the case, it's not a problem. If they start defecting, like they did in Syria, to side with the protesters, they rebel against certain orders to suppress them, then it could be quite serious. You could see a breakdown of the state entirely into like more of a civil war type situation. And that would be something we haven't seen indication of that yet, but that certainly would be a very serious
Yeah.
turn of events. And then thirdly, the government could compromise. They decide to compromise and say, well, we'll change this rule or we'll have a debate about this or something like that. It shows no indication of doing that either. So
Mm.
unfortunately, I think the most likely outcome is that the protests tire themselves out and go home, because it's unlikely the security forces are going to revolt because they're very tied to the economy of the state. Their own well-being and livelihood on a day-to-day basis is tied to this current system. So if I were to bet, I would say that the things would go on as they are unhappily. But you don't know. We can't say. That's just my
Well,
own.
I mean, I spoke to my family-in-law about this. They in Isfahan, and they said to us, it was no last week, that they think the protests are a bit exaggerated by the Western media.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's the case today. I haven't spoken to them since then. But the other thing that you mentioned in your article that I found quite interesting was the role of the Kurds in here, and I guess the Baluch. I saw yesterday in
Yeah.
the city on the border of Balochistan. There's another issue as well. I mean, how do you think this minority issue is being used to try and instigate regime change?
Well, obviously, the 1979 revolution in Iran, there was an uprising of Kurds took place thereafter who were not happy with the government generally. They just
Yeah.
didn't want to be ruled by Tehran in general. They're different ethnicity, they're different sect of Islam, they're Sunni. So they had a uprising at that time. It was suppressed by the new revolutionary guard at that time. Maybe many thousand people were killed. And Balochistan, which is a region which is in Iran and Pakistan, has long had a movement for independence in both those countries. So, I don't know if they really. This is the thing. Like, most Iranians do not want to see the country break up on ethnic grounds. They
Yeah.
want the borders of the country to stay the same as they are. And this includes people who hate the government, who would love the government to be taken out,
Well,
executed by the U.S. military. So,
well,
yeah.
a point that is missed about the Kurds. I mean, I don't know the Baluch issue that well. I probably should look more into it. But I know about the Kurds is this: when Saddam Hussein attacked Iran, he killed mostly Kurds because they're on the border of Iraq, and it was the Iranian army that came to rescue the Kurds. So yes, there is the '79 uprising. There is some. When I spoke to some Kurds that I know from Iran, there is some of them who want some form of autonomy. I don't think they want
Right, right,
independence.
right, right.
But my impression of the Kurds has been that the country in the Middle East that treats them the best is actually Iran, as opposed to the other
Yeah,
countries.
well, in Iran, they're allowed to be Kurds. They're allowed to use their language. They're allowed to identify
Mm.
as Kurds. Whereas in Turkey and Iraq, in Iraq they are now because they have autonomy, but in Turkey and Iraq historically they've not been allowed to. So I don't think necessarily they want to break away from the country, but I do think that the Adam, like, look, like the Islamic Republic is very bad for many reasons, but it's also capable of compromising on these issues. There are other more extreme nationalists who would like to take power. Some people not in the diaspora or elsewhere who are more like ethnically chauvinist, for instance, about their identity, and they could be harder to
Yeah.
deal with, for instance. Uh, so I don't think that the Kurds or Baloch are being used as a tool to impose regime change per se, but I do think that there are social divisions and ethnic divisions in Iran which can be exploited, and they also can be exacerbated when there's a condition of change and chaos. So it's something which you can take into account, and also this young woman who died in police custody was Kurdish as well too, which
Yeah.
is something which is definitely a factor.
So I want to ask you a controversial question, sort of last question on this young woman. I looked at the videotape that the government released. From that tape alone, I could not conclude that she was killed in, police custody. But I have spoken to, I know family of Shirin Ebadi, who won the Nobel Prize in 2003, was the
Yeah.
woman that prosecuted many of these cases. And she confirmed to us that this is one of many cases. It's a common thing to happen, you know. So just sort of like just reflection, but maybe on that particular point, do we have better evidence that what happened happened?
Well, I also saw a video, and I actually spoke to a friend in Iran after that to ask him what he thought about this. He said that, look, well, for those who didn't see, there's a video of her in some area of, she's in an area with a group of people after she's been detained, and then she's talking to somebody, and then she just collapses. So, I talked to him. I said, "What do you think about this?" He's like, "Well, you can't trust the government because look, they've lied about X, Y, and Z thing in the past.
Right.
So there's a lack of trust generally. So it maybe theoretically, she was not beaten to death, or maybe she had a stroke or something after custody. It's possible. I don't know. No one really knows because there's been no autopsy or independent investigation.
Mm.
The thing is, I think people it doesn't matter because they're like, we don't believe this has been lied about so many things in the past. We're not going to believe you now. We don't
It's
care
it,
that.
it's
Yeah.
similar to me to the Black Lives Matter protest in America, where the original videos, I'm very skeptical sometimes of the story that spreads faster than than the court can
Right,
collect evidence, right?
right.
But at the same time, it does speak to a underlying anger in the society, and
Exactly, exactly.
we have to distinguish the two.
Yeah, exactly. There's been a breakdown of trust generally. So, in the one sense, it doesn't even matter. It doesn't matter what actually happened, since people are just angry and they are tired of this and they don't trust the government. No matter what they say, no matter what evidence they did theoretically bring up, it wouldn't really matter. They're mad about the government generally. They're mad about other cases that they believe were took place very similar to this, which did happen or was not did not receive a lot of attention. So it's interesting, but it's almost a moot point. In fact, what actually happened? Her death has symbolized the anger of people for many different issues.
Mm. Okay, well,
Yeah.
Mutasa, I'd really like to thank you just for the conversation. And everyone, I encourage you to read this article on The Intercept called The Dark Arts Facing Iran's Brave Protesters. I think it's quite insightful, and anyone who calls for revolution should at least reflect, on that. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Nice talk to you.